Also, just as a reminder, for more Microsoft webcasts, you can visit microsoft.com/webcasts. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Microsoft webcast, Visualizing SQL and SQL Server Analysis Services Data in Visio 2007. And now, without any further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to today's presenter, Bill Morayan.
All right, good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon, depending on where you are. When I do these types of sessions, I like to always start off with a question. In this particular case, obviously it's a little more challenging to see what people's reaction is. But the question I like to ask is how many people deal with situations where either they or the applications they support, or in some way they just deal with too much data. There's just too much information coming in, and trying to understand it and trying to work with it is just too overwhelming. And I think you'll agree that that's a pretty common situation. And what we're trying to do with Visio 2007, one of the biggest investments we made is in visualizing data. And that's obviously one way to really help to process information and understand the kind of information that's coming in. So what I'm going to do today is run through some of the new features in Visio 2007 and talk about how you can use it to visualize data. The one thing I did want to mention before we get started is that this presentation, as I mentioned, is focusing on visualizing data itself and not on visualizing schema information or doing database reverse engineering. This is really about taking the data from your data sources, whether it's SQL Server and is the main one we're focusing on here, but also Excel data or Access or any other type of data, and bringing that in and visualizing it inside of Visio. The biggest situation, the biggest issue people have when they're thinking about visualizing data a lot of times is just trying to imagine what to visualize in the first place. And so the first thing I want to start with is just run through a couple of examples of types of visualizations that we see people out there doing, and types of visualizations that are interesting. And before I really dive into the individual examples, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our overall philosophy in this. And basically the idea that we've really focused on with Visio 2007 is the idea of data in context. So taking the data that you have and putting it in a context that you or that your end users or that someone you work with can really understand. And the idea there is to do it in the context of the domain that they're familiar with. So the first example I put up here is a process flow chart. So this is a very common visualization. People who manage processes, who do business performance improvement and quality and so forth, they tend to think and work in terms of flow charts. They build process diagrams. They spend a lot of time trying to talk with all the stakeholders, talk with all the people who are involved, and understand the process that they're working on. And during that course, there's also a lot of times a lot of data that's being collected and a lot of information that's being collected. And so what we're trying to do here is indicate about, oh, hold on. I just hit the wrong button here. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm going to try to get the highlighter here. But basically the idea is that you can see for each process step now, normally in a Visio diagram, these would just be plain boxes. And so in this particular case, what we're doing is we're overlaying a whole lot of other type of information on here. So you can see little bar charts, little flags, other types of data. And we'll get into a little more detail on all the possibilities. But the idea is take the data that you have, take the information that's coming out of systems that people are entering manually, and put that data right on top of the diagram where it's relevant, in the diagram that people understand. The next example here is familiar to a lot of people. This is just a standard network topology diagram. And so this is another what we call logical type of diagram. So it shows the relationships between the systems in this particular case, how they're connected up. And what we've done is this is a very traditional Visio diagram type, but what we've done is we've added in over here, you can see around a lot of data around what the IP address is, who the administrator is, some just basic textual information on top. So the last page we had a lot of coloring by value, conditional formatting type things. In this case we're just bringing text in, but it's another logical type of diagram. The next example here is a little more physical. So what we're doing here is showing a rack diagram, again another very common standard Visio diagram type, and overlaying data here, in this case a kind of a mixture of the two. So we've got some text information sitting across here on the right and the left that we pulled in from a data source. We're flagging particular issues. We're color coding the servers by a particular color. We have warnings. So we have a whole variety of different ways we're representing the data and laying that on top of a diagram. The next slide here is a decision tree. So now we're getting into some perhaps a little less standard Visio diagram types. And in this particular example, this is specific to data mining. So this is SQL Server Analysis Services data mining, and what we've done is they've created an add-in that goes with their application that lets them represent the data in Visio and dynamically creates and generates these diagrams using the same things we showed you before with the data graphics, which are these little widgets that kind of show the data, and then lets you show, in this particular case, pulled out of a data source, what kind of information drives the decision, in this particular case, of a bicycle purchase. So that was just a little bit of a flavor of the kind of examples of things you can do. But you can imagine a whole other set of examples. Just any kind of existing Visio diagram type that you think of as a traditional diagram type, or really anything else. Some of the other examples that we've seen in the past are people laying parking information on top of a city map. We see floor plans. We'll actually show you an example a little later on of a supermarket floor plan with data overlaid on sales. We've seen casino floor plans with data on top of them. So anything logical or physical, any kind of domain that you think of, there's almost always a diagram related to that. And what we're trying to make simple in this version of Visio is make you take the data that you already have, merge it with those diagrams, and make the real domain user, the person who's actually working in that. A supermarket manager understands his supermarket floor plan. That's what he lives and that's what he understands. Put the data there. Put the data where he can work with it. So in terms of an agenda, basically I'm going to run through kind of the three ways we sort of think of Visio diagrams and Visio data visualization. And that is, the first one is out of the box. So this is what you can do through the user interface, just starting from scratch in Visio. And it's very simple to get started. The next one is add-ins, and so the idea here is this is like the SQL Server data mining. So these are either Microsoft produced or third-party produced tools that let you visualize a specific domain. So there's add-ins in Project that let you generate Visio diagrams, work breakdown structures, and such from project diagrams. And then the third piece that we'll talk about is building solutions. And so this is actually using some code to create a diagram, or either to create a diagram or to enhance a diagram using Visio. I'm going to try to keep, as we walk through this, I'm going to try to keep the text in the slides and so forth to a minimum. I want to focus as much as possible on the demos and on demonstrating some code. And so the first two sets of these we'll walk through and really focus very much on the demos. And the third we'll talk a little more about the code and how you build up an application. Okay. So the first one I want to start with here is the basic introduction to the data features in Visio 2007. So I'll jump over to my application. So this is Visio, and what we've got here is just a very standard network diagram using the network diagram shapes in Visio 2007. And I've already got this created. And then what I also have, and you'll find this very common, is I've also got an asset list that has a whole bunch of data on each server. So I'll zoom in a little bit here to one section of the diagram. And you can see what I have here is just a very basic set of information on each machine. In this particular case, the machine name, what network it sits on, and that's really about it. But now what I want to do is I'm going to go to the Data menu in Visio and click on Link Data to Shapes. And then I'm going to walk through, and you can see I have a variety of different data sources I can choose from. We'll talk about this in a little more detail later on, but the idea is I can just pick any data source I want. In this particular case, I'll choose Excel. And I can browse for the specific workbook that I'm interested in. and I'm going to grab just a very simple network data diagram. And so after I finish doing that, I can click through and I can choose either a custom range from Excel that'll open up Excel and let me pick it. I can just select a named range or a workbook. And then I can go through and start to do some basic filtering on this data. What we recommend is that when you're doing this, we actually bring the data that you select into the diagram. So you want to make sure that you're narrowing down the data set to the very specific data that you're interested in. So in this particular case, it's actually a relatively small data set, so I don't need to do any filtering. But you can see I can go in and select some, for instance, the different data columns that I want. I've got the operating system, the administrator, status, etc. I can select or deselect those, and then I can do some basic row filtering as well. So I'll click on Finish here, because I've got the data I wanted. And now you can see on the bottom here what's happened is the data has been brought into the diagram. So we have basic information on the individual servers, we've got their IP address, we have their location, asset ID, etc. And so what I can do is I can just grab a row of data now. In this particular case, you can see I've got AD 1423, and I can just drag the row of data out. And I'm not sure if you can see this over the live meeting, but there's a blue hinting that's appearing, and that indicates that when I let go of the mouse, it's going to drop this data and attach this data to this particular shape in the diagram. And so you can see now, well, I should probably need to zoom in here. But so what I've done is now it's created a data graphic which has tied some of this information in. So now we've got the location, we've got the IP address, and we've got the administrator, and that's all hooked up to this individual shape. And so if I go into the shape data, you can see all this data is hooked up. But we've just sort of selected a few individual pieces of data to display in the diagram in order to give you something to start with. So what I can do now is I can walk through and grab rows of data and drag them out, and I can do that for all of them, and you can see this is going to continue happening. But obviously when you have a large diagram, as this is, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, that can get a little tedious. And in this case, you can see we've already got the machine names hooked up to the individual, or tied or typed into text for all the individual machines. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to now go back to Data and select Automatically Link. And what this will do, we'll walk through and in this case find all the shapes on the page, and I can choose some information from the data. So in this case, name, it's a machine name, and match that to shape text. And you can also use any sort of data set that you or any data field that you want. You can match multiple criteria, and then I click Finish, and what it's going to do is it's going to walk through. And now you can see that all of these shapes on the page have been linked up to data. Also, all the ones that actually had data sitting behind them are all linked up now. Now another thing that you can notice is that in here we have now a little lock symbol that indicates that this has been linked, so a little chain symbol. And there's actually a shape that has not been linked here, or a row of data that has not been linked. And if you want to take that row and drop it on the page, all you have to do is you just select over in the Shapes window on the left, you select the shape that you want, in this particular case a server, grab that row of data, and I can drag it out. And when I drag it, it'll show me the shape that's going to be dropped, and then I let go, and it now not only hooks it in, it can not only hook up a shape to data, but it can also drop out a new linked shape. And so this has the information that's been brought out. So let me jump back up here and zoom in a little bit, because you can see here that we've got some good information, we've got this text that we wanted, but a lot of times that's not the only stuff you want to see, or you want to be able to kind of take a quick glance at the diagram and understand quickly what's going on. So we have this new feature in Visio 2007 called Display Data on Shapes. I'll click on that option here, and we open up the taskbar. And the idea behind displaying data is that one of the most common things you do when you have data behind a shape is you want to figure out a few different ways to view the data. And so if I edit this data graphic, a data graphic is a bundle of ways to display the actual information. So you can see we've got text as a way to take that data and show it. We have the notion of data bars. So the idea here is that you can take any piece of numerical data, and you can have single or multiple pieces of numerical data, and you can choose to display that as one of these little widgets to kind of give you a little bit of a mini graph on some some piece of some shape on the diagram. And the idea here is obviously not to replace Excel or some other charting package, but it's to just give you a simple way to very quickly view what's going on numerically on a piece of on a shape in the diagram. The other option here is you can use icon sets. So in this particular case, what I'll do is say, look at patches, and I want to say that if, you can see we've got a whole variety of these, and you can actually not only use, these are all the built-in data, the built-in icon sets, but you can also create your own. There's a whole bunch of articles that we've created out there on how to create your own icon sets, and these are essentially just Visio shapes with some that sort of conform to an interface that we've specified, and you just create the shape in a specific way, and it'll appear in this list. So what I want to do here is say that if the shape that we have here doesn't contain a specific patch, then I would like to flag it with this warning symbol. And I can locate this and say I want to put it on the right edge and put it on the top edge of the shape. So it's going to put it up in the upper right-hand corner here. I click Apply. And let's see, I guess my data set does contain that information because it's not showing the, here, I'll have to use a different one here. So if I add a different patch that none of these have, you can see now that that'll appear up. So when the patch was already applied, all the machines were fine, but now there's a different patch, and so now each of these machines has been flagged as missing this specific patch. So you can see here that gives you one way to show information. The other thing, another type of information, a way that you can show information here is through color by value. So in this particular case, what I want to do is just to give myself a sense of who's managing each individual machine, I'll click on Admin. In this particular case, we've got two different administrators. I'm going to choose some slightly less garish colors here. A little bit more subtle. Click OK. And when I'm done, and I'll zoom out here a little bit to see, you can see that my entire diagram has been color-coded based on who administers each individual machine. And so you can see now, just quickly at a glance, whose machines are having problems, whose machines have some particular issue. So you can walk through and very quickly build up a diagram that tells you a lot more. I mean, pretty much everyone who manages the network has some sort of a network diagram like this, and they also tend to have some sort of an asset list along these lines. And so by bringing the two together and merging that information, you can really take something that's a lot more actionable and it's a lot more useful. And certainly to the extent that you have information that's kept more up to date on the assets, for instance, the server load or the disk usage, things like that, you can really start to use this as a little more of a dashboard, something that can be managed on a moment-by-moment basis. So the next example I want to show you quickly here is a very similar diagram type. Let me close out here. Or excuse me, not a very similar diagram type, but I just want to show that the type of thing that we showed there can be applied to any diagram type in Visio. So this is a flow chart. And just as I did in the network example, I can go out, link data to shapes, connect up to the same types of data sources, bring the data in, visualize that kind of data. And in this particular case, what I want to show you is rather than walk through the same process again, I'm going to show you what it looks like when I'm done. And you can see here now what I've done is I've created the entire diagram with a few different data graphics. So here now what I'm showing is on the left, information on, in this case, cycle time and cost for the process, for individual steps in the process. So I've got cycle time and cost for each individual step, and then I've got some basic information on kind of how that sits compared to what we expect. And then I can open up the display data on shapes window. And what I've done now here is I've actually created a few different visualizations. So these are different bundles of data graphics. So you can see here that the one I'm viewing is around cycle time and cost. If I'm trying to improve the performance of the process, I can just click on or I can just show the current data graphic. But if I want to see, for instance, something different, I'll click on Controls, and now this will switch. It'll apply the data graphic to all the shapes. It's going to walk through, and now we've got the same information on the name of each step, but now it's showing the owner of each individual process, whether the controls are adequate. So this is more of a compliance type of scenario. Same process, just slightly different type of information. And then the last one I'll show here is something that's a little more focused on exceptions. So I'll just switch over to a different data graphic that shows me how many exceptions, how many issues are occurring at that specific step that we may have to concur. So I can look at the compliance angle, I can look at the cycle time angle, so sort of the amount of time it takes to process each step, and then I can look at how many essentially errors are happening in here. And you can see that it's just very easy to walk through and edit these bundles, these quality trends and so forth, the bundles of data. As long as the data is in there, this uses standard Visio data graphic or shape data, which used to be known as custom properties, and you can just take that and surface it very quickly onto an individual diagram. So that feature, that entire feature is known as data link, the idea of taking an existing diagram and connecting it up to data. The other diagram type that I want to show you today, the other type of visualization, I'm going to close out of a few of these here, is the notion of pivot diagrams. So again, this is another way to take your data, but this is less about taking an existing diagram and matching it up to data, and more about generating a new diagram from the data immediately. So the idea is, if you've ever used a pivot table, the concept is similar, but the idea here is instead of being a tabular report that comes out, you end up with a visual diagram. And it's a full-fledged Visio diagram. So once you build it up, you can really start to use it just as you would use any diagram. But it lets you bring some aggregate data and some data onto the page very quickly. So the first thing I want to do here is I'm just going to grab some access data, but you can see we can use Windows SharePoint Services lists, and that also includes Office SharePoint Services as well. We can use SQL Server, we can use Analysis Services, so we can hook directly up to cubes here, and then any OLADB or ODBC data source. And if you're familiar at all with the notion of an Office data connection, which is essentially a centralized way that you can manage connections, this is shared across a lot of the Office products, including InfoPath and Excel and Visio, and it gives you a way to centrally manage connections so that for instance, an end user doesn't really have to understand what server they're connecting to or anything along those lines. It just gives them a way gives administrators a way to publish a specific connection up and have end users use that connection without really having to know all the technical details that are going on behind the scenes. So I'll take an existing data source, and the idea here is that this is a call center. So what we're doing is we're managing a series of call centers across globally, and we want to sort of walk through and create a quick dashboard of how those call centers are performing. And so what I'm going to do here is, you can see, just to start off, when we go and we connect up to the data source, what this is doing is it's creating a single kind of root node here, which basically is the top shape. And what that's doing is it's aggregating all of the data. So we've pulled in some information about all the calls into all of our call centers globally. So over this period, we've got 70,490 calls. And now, over on the left, we have two basic concepts. We have the idea of adding categories and the idea of adding totals. So when it comes to categories, what we're doing is we're breaking down the data in a variety of different ways. So if I select total here and then click on priority, for instance, when I click on that, it breaks those 70,000 calls down into 22,000 high priority calls, 15,000 low priority, and 32,000 medium priority calls. Similarly, I can click on this and say, I'm not so interested in it by priority, but I want to understand it by category. So hardware calls, password calls, remote access calls, software, etc. And then what I can do is I can actually break those down further. So if I click on hardware, I can click down below on location. And what that'll do now is break my hardware calls into Bangalore, Buenos Aires, Milan, etc. And so I can keep on doing that and keep on breaking those calls down in a variety of different ways. The other thing we can do here is, let's say we're not as interested in the total number of calls. I mean, that's obviously an important number to have, but at the same time, we're interested in some other pieces of data that we've been tracking. And some of that might be, for instance, the customer satisfaction, the total call time. So let's say we want to see the average call time. We just drop down this menu, click on average call time, and it's going to now break it down. And you can see across these different shapes, we've got a whole variety of different types. The values are broken down, and so you can see that I'm going to collapse this particular one here. But for hardware, for instance, we have 5.38 minutes per call. For passwords, they're relatively quick. Remote access are also relatively quick. So these different, we can see the overall times are kind of broken down in that way. And I can go in and just as I did in the initial diagram, I can go in and edit the data graphic. So just the notion of a data graphic that I showed you in the last demo is very much something that's across the product now. So in the same way that I did this, let's say I'm not interested in seeing average call time as a text field, but instead what I want to see is for instance, a data bar that represents, use a speedometer, so one of these little widgets, and I want to see the average customer satisfaction, scale of 0 to 1 in this particular case. Actually, I want to edit the label to say cust sat, click OK, and then I'll click Apply, and you can see now that we have a kind of a slightly nicer visualization. In this particular case, all these are the customer stat is the same. But now if I broke this down by location, for instance, we can see that the numbers have gotten a little different now. So what we have is the total calls now broken down by location, and we've got sort of a nicer visualization. We can go through and all the things we did in the previous one we can do here as well. So if we wanted to color code these by some other value, for instance, if the solve rate is a particular level or customer satisfaction change, you can kind of walk through and do a variety of different things here. But the basic idea is that you take the data, take the information, break it down, and we don't really expect people to use this as their main analytical tool. What we think that the best and most useful way to work with this is to really focus on using this feature as a way to kind of get the data out there and get it to a point where you can turn it into something that you might want to present or put into a document that you're going to distribute more broadly. So with that in mind, what I want to do here is, you can see that I've got my shapes out here. I've got the basic locations. And now, as I mentioned before, these are all just Visio shapes. So I can go and take my connectors, I can delete those, I can start to move these guys around a little bit. They all just work, and I can still go and refresh the data. This is all live, even though these things have been moved around. I've deleted the title over here. Even though all that information's gone, it's all fully refreshable. And I can choose whether I want this to lay out automatically or whether I want to manage the layout myself. In this case, I want to manage the layout myself. And what I'm going to do is what I'm going to do here now is actually take a map. So I'm going to go into some shapes that I already have. Got a regular Visio stencil in this particular case. I'm going to just drag the map out. And you can see it's a world map that now sits behind my diagram. And I can take the total, move it here. I can hopefully show you some geometry skills or geography skills that are not too terrible, and move these various shapes kind of into their location in the world. And so now you can see we've got Bangalore, we've got Milan, we've got Buenos Aires, and we have all the information. And the really nice thing about this is we can take this, so now this is essentially a fully built dashboard that's kind of ready to go in just a few minutes, and it's still live. So if I click on Buenos Aires here, and then I want to break Buenos Aires down by, for instance, the priority, I can just click on that, and it still shows me all of the information, the high, low, medium. I can collapse it. So now this is a dashboard, but it can still be used actively as a way to kind of monitor the status and monitor how things are happening. Okay, so that is pivot diagrams. And so you can see there's kind of two primary ways of bringing data into Visio. One is through data link, which is about just taking individual rows of data, existing rows of data, and bring them into an existing diagram. And the second is pivot diagrams, which is more about generating a new diagram from scratch. Okay, so I'll close this out. And I'll go back over to the slides. So the next example that I wanted to just talk briefly about, I won't do a demo here because we're running a little bit short on time, and I want to make sure to cover the last example here as well, is the data mining add-in. So this is an example of a created add-in that the the SQL Server team at Microsoft created using Visio as a development platform. And the basic idea here is that that team had created a way to visualize these data mining add-ins. So the example diagram that you see here is it's called a clustering diagram. And so essentially what they do is they walk through databases and use some algorithms to figure out what relationships, in this particular case, purchases have to each other. So how particular types of purchases are clustered together. And obviously this is a very deep and complex domain, but at the same time it's something that they've worked really hard to make relatively easy. And so what a lot of times happens is people do this analysis using the data mining tool in SQL Server, and then they need a way to visualize that data. And so there's a bunch of standard visualizations that they use, and the team created a tool within Visual Studio that let you actually visualize this data there. What they found, though, and I think a lot of people have found this as well, is that getting that information and visualizing and kind of creating the visualization is not really enough. That you need to ultimately take that information and put it into a presentation, annotate it, you need to work on it further and really make it clear what you're trying to present. So it's not just enough to sort of generate the diagram itself, you really need to have it be flexible and have it be something that can be used and presented correctly. So what they did is they created a Visio add-in that connects up to their server and generates these types of diagrams. So it's just uses the APIs and so forth that I'll show you in a second. And the idea here is that you just take that. You as an end user don't really need to know that much about the complexity that sits behind their server. You just use Visio as a front end to that information, to that data. So the next thing what I want to do here is now move from kind of the add-ins that are available third party. There's a few other ones out there. Like I think I mentioned before, but Microsoft Office Project has an add-in that runs with Visio and lets you visualize project data inside of Visio. There's also an add-in that has been created by the Performance Point team to do strategy maps. So there's a whole series of these types of add-ins that really let you see this information and see this type of data. And now what I want to do is walk through and explain a little bit about how you actually create these types of add-ins and applications on top of Visio. And so the core concept here is that we really see Visio as the visualization surface. So it's a place to essentially draw and very easily create these types of applications, but your application itself obviously has a lot of the value behind it. So in the concept of that data mining, Visio itself doesn't know about data mining, but Visio is the visualization surface that tool will use to present the information. All right, so what I'll do here to start off is just kind of give you a sense of the application that I'm going to build here. We'll walk through it very briefly and talk about it, and then I'll kind of walk through the code. So we'll spend a little bit of time in the code here, but I don't want to spend all that much time. If people have additional questions about that, we can cover that during the question and answer session. All right, so this is running a little slowly as I've got my machine a little loaded up, I think, but it should come up in a second here. Okay, so the idea here, just as I talked about at the beginning, let me resize this so it fits in the page, is that this is a supermarket floor plan. So essentially you can see that we've got a standard blueprint that in this particular case we pulled in from an architect. So pretty much everyone who runs a building or runs a plan has something like this sitting around. They've gotten it from their architect. Maybe it's on paper, maybe and they need to scan it in, or maybe they get it in through AutoCAD. But the basic idea is you have that information. And then what we've done is we've taken, and you can see these little individual sections. So we've taken the individual shelves, and we've done over here is indicated how each of the shelves is performing. So basically against our plan for revenue, for profit, and for units, we have the data broken out. So here now this is showing revenue, and you can see there's a couple of these sections that are red, so they're not performing as well against plan. You can click on profit, and when I switch that over, you can see the colors are going to change. And so there's a few more sections here that have been broken down and that aren't performing that well. And then by units here now, we can see there's another one. And so what we've done in each particular case is we've taken the data and applied a data graphic that we pre-built in order to highlight where there might be potential issues in the supermarket overall. And then the next thing you can do here is you can just click on the details and break things down by a specific shelf. But and that demo is something that we'll show a little, hopefully later on today. But if not, the code's available, and people can follow up with me to see it. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is jump back over to Visual Studio to show you how this is done. Okay, so I'll stop that. And in order to do this, what I'd like to do is actually just start and create this. I'm going to close this project and create this from scratch to kind of show you how easy it is to kind of just generate this completely from scratch. So I'm going to click on Create a Project. And what I'm doing here is doing a basic WinForms application. So in this case, what Visio has is an ActiveX control. So what you saw in the previous example was Visio itself, so the Visio application. But what we also let you do is take the Visio drawing surface, so it's kind of just the visual part, and add that into your own application. And what we can do here is, it'll take a second to come up. So this is just a basic WinForm application, and this can be anything. You can do Win32 applications, you can do XAML, etc. And then I'm going to go and grab, let's see, I'm going to grab the Visio drawing control and drop that out. Okay, so this brings the actual drawing control out. I'm just going to make a couple of quick setting changes here to anchor it up to make it look a little nicer when we expand it out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump over very quickly to the code here. And I'm going to use some code snippets to kind of show you what, rather than have you watch me type, to kind of dump out some code, and then we'll just talk about it. So the first thing is I just want to bring in my own namespace here, the standard Visio namespace here. So Microsoft Office Interop Visio, and so then what I'm going to do next, bring out a code snippet, and I'm going to bring out the basic objects that I need. And so what you can see here is I've got a Visio document, a page, and application. So our ActiveX control is really a very thin wrapper around the full Visio application. So when you program against it, you have the full power that you would have when you're programming against Visio and VBA or in any type of an add-in. So we just kind of grab that basic information. We've got a connection string to connect up to, in this particular case, to connect up to our stored data. And then we've got a couple of command strings that we're using to pull specific pieces of data out. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is do a little more setup. So now what I'm doing is I'm setting what's called the source, so the SRC of the drawing control. So this is the drawing control that I dropped out, basically the Visio diagram, and then I'm bringing in a specific diagram that I had before, which is just that floor plan without any of the colors or anything along those lines. And then I'm going to, from that drawing control, I'm going to grab the document and grab the pages and applications so I can kind of work with them. It makes it a little simpler. Next thing here I'm going to do is create the connections. So what this is actually the first sort of code that's actually doing the new data. The idea behind the new Visio data APIs is to simplify some things that people really struggled with in the past. So just as in the UI before we showed you, we created a way to very easily manually link things to data. We've got the equivalent on the programmatic side, so that it lets you automatically do this through your own code. So if you've ever done any programming like this in Visio before, you know that it's been a very painful process overall to kind of link data, keep it up to date, refresh it, etc. And so what we've done is really focused on making that as simple as possible. So what this does is the basic workflow of creating the connection. So we think of this in terms of the idea of create a new connection, so connect to the actual data, link individual shapes to data. So take the data that's now been brought into the diagram. So in this particular case, this is VSO data, and we want to link excuse me here, we want to take that data and we want to link rows of data to the shapes. So this is a little bit more complicated. In the case of bringing in the connection, it's very simple. You give it a command string and a query string, and you just bring that in. When we're linking data to shapes, what we have to do here is I create a selection of shapes. So I select all the shapes that are relevant to me. We use a few of these system arrays. So this is just a little bit of going from Visio, which is a COM application, into a .NET application, and create kind of some of the rules. In this particular case, shelf ID is the matching term that we use, just as we did when we automatically linked through the user interface. And we have to choose the name of the field in the shape and the name of the field in the data source. And then we auto-link the two. So we based on that selection, we automatically link the two. So now once we've done this, the data will be linked together with the shape. And that'll bring the data in, and that'll show you, or it'll have now the data all hooked up to the shape, but it doesn't actually display the data in the color codes. So the last piece that we have to do is this apply data graphic step. And when I click on that, all we do is we've added in for each new shape and selection the idea of a data graphic property. And so this will let you, when you set a data graphic to be a specific data graphic, and so what I've done here is I've stored a new data graphic in that in the diagram called shelf graphic. And this is the way we recommend that you do this, that you take the shelf, or you take the data graphics and you pre-create those using the user interface, and then you programmatically apply those. That's the easiest way to kind of get it up and get it running quickly, and you don't have to go through as much programming. You can see that basically here, creating the connection is one line of code, applying the data graphic is one line of code. The linking is a little more work, but you're still talking about fundamentally 5 or 6 lines of code to kind of get the selection set up and so forth. And then once you've done that, I'll run this here, and you'll see that it'll walk through. Take a second to compile, and we'll end up with the diagram set up with the data graphic applied, and so with the color coding all applied. So you can see this is, if anyone's done any Visio programming before around with data, you know that this is something that would take a lot of work in terms of custom shape work. It would take a lot of work in terms of programming to maintain the data connections. And now with just those few lines of code, we've built up essentially this little application that shows all the information kind of in the context where it matters, so on the supermarket floor plan. Okay, so I want to jump over to the slides here again. We'll come back over to the data and just talk a little bit more about this sort of workflow that we described to you earlier. The first piece here, as we talked about, so import the data, bring it into the diagram, link the data, map a specific row of data to a specific shape, and then display the data. So take the data that's now on the shape and surface that in the diagram. And then similarly in the import, we have this notion of refresh. So you can programmatically or manually refresh the data continuously, and it really gives you a good idea of how to it gives you a simple way to do that. So that's again one line of code, and then it'll propagate its way all the way through everything that it's linked to in the data display. So you don't have to kind of keep on doing that work yourself. We'll manage that all once you've brought the data in. So overall, just wanted to kind of step back a tiny bit and talk about how we think of Visio solutions. Visio, the application, down at the bottom here, we really call this the engine. So that's kind of the core application itself. And then there's kind of two core ways that you program against Visio. The first is through the object model, which is what I just showed you there. So this is basically working with the application as you would in VBA or as ComAd and anything like that. And then we have primary interop assemblies to let you program via .NET, which is what I was doing there. The other way to program Visio essentially is through the shape sheet, and this is it's kind of a topic that's a little too big to cover here, but the idea is you can customize and build specific shapes that behave in a specific way, and we really recommend that people look at this as a way to minimize the amount of code that they actually have to write. Once they've done that, then there's kind of two ways that you can service it. What I was showing you there was an ActiveX control application that was embedded inside of your own application. But the other option, if you think your users are a little more familiar with Visio, then the best thing to do here is you can take you can either program in VBA as a COM add-in, or you can do a Visio add-on, which is the more traditional way. And if you want to do .NET app programming, the recommended way is through COM add-in. It's the easiest way overall. So moving on here, in terms of importing data, the basic idea here is that you have the external data source, and for that data source we create a data connection, and then specifically within that data connection we have a data record set, which is the data that's been brought in and used. And so then this is essentially what you're doing. Everything in this section here is what you're doing. This all sits off of the document, and this is what we were doing, that line of code. We basically just take a command string, connection string, and we'll manage everything from that point on. So if you give that to us, then you can go through and refresh and work with the data as easily as you want. You can actually go in and access the data itself as well if you want to, but you don't really need to. For the most part, that everything can be managed from that point on. I mentioned already the notion of Office data connections, but the idea here is that this is a managed connection that can be created automatically by an administrator, and then you can work through that connection. And that way, if an administrator updates from, for instance, a staging server to a production server, that can flow into your application automatically. Other data sources we have here, SQL Server, Excel, Access, all kinds of SharePoint. We use XML. For XML, this is only available programmatically, so there's not a way through the user interface to work with XML data. But what we do is we allow you to, we have a schema that you can use, and that'll let you bring in XML data, so you can connect up, for instance, to a web service and bring in your data that way. And then the other options here is you can use OLADB, ODBC, kind of the other ways to hook up to a broader set of databases out there. The next option here is the idea of kind of linking. So this is a second step in the workflow. So the idea here on the left is we've got the shapes in the diagram, and then on the right, this is the record set that you've brought into the diagram. And you can see that a row of data essentially maps to an individual shape. So, and obviously these rows of data, you can have a query or a stored procedure behind that to kind of aggregate the data or work with it however you want. And then you link the two together. So we start off with kind of the two separate, and then as the data updates, what happens is when you link it, it'll bring those in. It'll create shape data fields for that. It'll now create the information, And then you can see as the data changes, so if you refresh the data as the data changes over here, we've got the age now changing, and we'll automatically roll that into the individual shapes, and then that can propagate on through everything else that you need to do. So that's all handled automatically. The last concept I want to talk about here is the concept of displaying data. And so basically the idea here is this is what we showed you in the user interface. And the idea is all of these individual items are individual graphic items. So you can see this title here, this FS01, this IP. These are what we call text items. This is a data bar, so you can see the little widget that we showed you before. This is an icon set. So these are all the different ways you can display data, and then you bundle all those together into a single data graphic. So this whole thing here on the right is all the data graphic, and a data graphic is associated specifically with a shape. So the idea is you set the data graphic property on a shape to be a specific data graphic, and then that looks at the shape data to pull out all the information that drives, for instance, this IP address or the disk usage or anything along those lines. So that gives you that way of looking at the information. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see, we've got about 7 minutes left. So what I'll do just here is jump back over into the application. I want to show you just a little bit more about how you can change. What we did already, you can see we applied the data graphic to the diagram. And the next thing I want to do here is take that information, and I want to give myself a way to programmatically change the data graphic. So you can see I've already applied the data graphic, and now what I'm going to do is update that data graphic. So this is a little more lines of code, but not too many more. The basic idea I'm doing here is I'm taking the notion of a Visio master. So the master is kind of the it's sort of essentially the class that each shape on the page is coming from. And what we're doing is we're using that. Data graphics are really just Visio masters. So they're really just a type of Visio shape. And so I'm pulling from our document an existing shelf graphic, the one that I applied. So it's been applied up here, up top. And so now I'm just taking it, I'm going to modify it. And then I open a copy. This is just the way you edit masters of a diagram. So you open a copy of the master. You change that. So in this particular case, I'm going to take an individual graphic item from the master because I know it's the first one since that's the one I created. It's just a color by value. And then depending on what radio button I check, and I'll flip over to set up that event, then it's going to pull a different column from the data source. So in this case, revenue percent plan, profit percent plan, or unit percent plan, those three are all in there. And depending on which one I've checked, it's going to set the expression, which is the way you change the properties of data graphics. So I need to just hop over to the designer here and add in my, where did they go here? Somehow I lost my radio buttons. Oh, there we are. So I'll drop in my my radio buttons here, just 3 of those. And so, as you saw before, we've got revenue. So just revenue. Profit and units. And then what I'm going to need to do is basically just set the event so that when I click on these guys, I'll run that little method that I just created called update data graphic. So I need to set that for all those. Run the application here. Sorry about this. It's taking a second on this machine. It's a little slow. But once it pops up, now when we click on these individual ones, what it's doing, as you saw in the code, is it's actually switching the data graphics and switching the names. So here is the first data graphic applied just as it was before. And then I'll scale this up a little bit. And when it goes, now I'll click on units up here. So it gives me some control. And you can see now it's walked through, and as I click on these individual items, it's changing how the data graphics have been applied, or what data the data graphics represent. So it gives you a way to kind of switch the view of the diagram very quickly. Okay, and that's it. I'll skip this slide since we're done and it's just a review, and I'll hand it back over.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. I do want to remind everybody that for more information, they can print a PDF of today's session. To do that, just go to the File menu in your upper navigation bar. Now is a good time to submit your questions into the Q&A panel. You just want to type them in and hit that Ask button. Also, I'm going to be posting a survey here in just a minute. If you would all please take a moment to fill it out before you log off. We do appreciate your feedback. As a reminder, for upcoming and previously recorded webcasts, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/webcast. You can go here to access this webcast, which will be available for download in about 24 hours. Now, if you have any webcast content ideas, something out there you'd like to see and haven't seen it yet, we'd love to hear from you. Take note of this link here. And for anybody who's interested in receiving a free 14-day trial of Microsoft Office Live Meeting, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/presentlive. And here is the survey from our session today. Please follow the links provided to complete today's webcast evaluation. And Bill, it does look like you have some questions waiting there for you.
Okay, so I'll pick up the questions here. The first one is from Karen, and there's a couple of questions here. The first one is for not to replace Excel. What is the memory footprint of Visio versus Excel? And I'm actually not sure. Not exactly sure what it is. I believe they're relatively similar overall, but unfortunately I don't know that offhand. If you want to follow up with another question with your email address, I can send you find that out and send you the answer. All right. And then her second question is, did you happen to write up a summary of your BI Chalk Talk session? And the answer on that one is no, I have not done so, and I need to actually take this code and package it up. So I'll do that. And if anyone wants to see that, you can check my my blog, which is at blogs.msdn.com/WMOREIN. And I will put up sometime in the next week or so, I'll make sure to package up this code and put it up there as well. Okay, the next question is from Mark, and the question here is, can you merge data graphics to other similar graphics? And then the question is, e.g. PC stats applied to server. And I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but if the question is, can you have essentially multiple data graphics or multiple pieces of multiple types of data all on one shape? And so for instance, you have pulling from a couple of different data sources and pulling data from there. The answer is yes, you can do that. You can have as much data as you want on each individual shape from as many different data sources. And then you can use data graphics. Each shape can only have one actual data source in, each shape can only have one data graphic applied, but that data graphic can pull from as many data sources as need be. Oh, so okay, the clarification from Mark on the question was, can you use the same stats data graphic and then apply it for PCs and against for servers? And the answer is yes. Data graphics will work for any shape type and multiple different shapes. So yes, that is something that you can do. Next question from Jack. Can you publish this to SharePoint as a dynamic web page? And the answer to that is no right now. Once you can publish diagrams to SharePoint, there's a few different ways to do that, and in general, those once you publish them, they are static at that point. The only caveat to that is actually you can use the web part, or excuse me, the ActiveX control as a web part, but the problem with that is you need to if you want that to still be dynamic, you need to have Visio installed on all the individual machines. But And you also need to change some security settings. So we don't really recommend doing that using the ActiveX control as part of a web part. But having said that, this is something that we know this is probably the single biggest question and issue that we get. So it's something that we're actively looking at and working on. So sort of keep your eyes posted on that one. And the next one is, can you type the URL to your blog? And I'm not sure if there's a way I can do this globally. I'll set up the answer or I'm going to type it into this specific answer. I'm not sure if everyone can see this. I'll post this to all, so hopefully people will be able to see that. So now if you look down the question and answer section, there's my the address to my blog there as well. And that looks like that's all the questions. So unless anyone else has any questions, please, thanks for attending and listening in. And if you have any more questions, any more detailed questions or anything, feel free. There's a contact form on that blog that I just posted the link to, and feel free to either post a comment or just post a question in that, and I can answer it there. Okay.
Excellent. Well, with that, I do want to extend a very special thank you to you, Bill, for your presentation today and for answering all the great questions we had come through the queue. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to conclude today's session. Thank you for joining us. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's presentation.